Hello, welcome to Animazing, the stories of Kevin Seymour. My name is Aramis, and today is our first episode. Isn't that awesome? I've been waiting for this to get off the ground for so long. Moving on. This one is on Ghost in the Shell, which was released in Japan, 95, and in the US in 96. Licensed by Manga Entertainment, and produced by Animaze Inc., with the recording studio being done at Magnitude 8 Post. So, first and foremost, before I get into this, I just want to say that this is not an overall review of the Ghost in the Shell storyline. I may bring up points of the story just for context of the line delivery. This is more so a review of the dub. My own analysis of the dub, my own thoughts of the dub, and when I do have the information behind the scenes of each dub. I know for this dub in particular, I don't have too much behind the scenes information, just because I haven't done a lot of the interviews as of recording this episode. But I plan on going back either with an addendum piece or I might just redo the episode down the line once I get more industry interviews done and sorted. With that all being said, I'm going to go through and list off some of the crew, and then I'm going to go into it. The way I'm going to format this is essentially, if you're watching along at home, I guess, I'm going to go ahead and discuss the dub in the order of scenes in which, major scenes. So, with Ghost in the Shell, it's very simple. You have your main scenes, and then they're usually divided up by these gorgeous musical shots with gorgeous animation. So the way I'll be covering it like that. With that being said, I'm going to go over the crew real quick because they are the reason why this dub got made. They're the reason, came to the West. They're the reason why it got mixed. The thankless jobs, if you will. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And all of this information, by the way, can be found on the Animazing website. All this information that I'm telling you about, it is on the archive tab. So, first of all, we have the director, which was listed as Quint Lancaster, one of Kevin Seymour's more known aliases now. So, that's pretty simple. Producer through Manga Entertainment was Lawrence Guinness. I'm still looking into him, but there's a lot of those. Anything usually Manga Entertainment, it was Lawrence Guinness who usually was behind that. ADR script, it's our good friend Quint Lancaster again. So that would be Kevin Seymour. ADR script, again, this time it is Mary Claypool as the pseudonym Mary Mason. ADR recording, we have Joe Romersa. Translation, we have both Taro Yoshida and Paul C. Halbert. For coordination, we have Yutaka Masiba and Taro Yoshida, and Nobuhiro Hayashi. For audio post supervisor and additional sound effects, both we have Les Claypool III. Under the credits, he was listed as Les E. Claypool. So there's that. And lastly, we have from the final re-recording was done by Ground Control Studios, and the personnel that they had doing that was, I'm going to butcher this name, Paul Ratajczak. Ratajczak. I swear I didn't mean to butcher that. And then the other re-recording mixer is Kurt Kassulke, Kassulke. And then mixer assistant was Armin Boyles. From my research, I noticed a lot of these guys had moved on to either form their own company or were very high up at a mixing company. So they've come a long way since the late 90s. With that all being said, let's just go ahead and introduce our players now, our leads, so I don't have to bring them up in each individual scene, and I can kind of talk about their performances since they are covered throughout the entirety of the movie. First, if you've never seen Ghost in the Shell, just a quick little debrief. It's set in the year 2029, has espionage, intrigue. Essentially, I'm going to butcher the plot if I go through it. Go watch Ghost in the Shell. I really don't want to spoil it. Just know It questions humanity, it questions what is a living being, and the dub itself and the actors portraying the characters do a good job of asking those questions and being those roles. So, the first character, the leads include Major Motoko Kusanagi, who is portrayed by Mimi Woods, and then we have Bato, which, depending on the credits you list, he has a few different spellings, but I'm going to go with the spelling that was actually listed later, which is Batou, and that was played by Richard Epcar under the pseudonym Richard George. And then I'll list a few more out just to the fact that they're some of our leads. We have Daisuke Aramaki, the Section 9 chief, played by William Frederick Knight. We have Togusa, who is one of the partners for the leads, played by Christopher Joyce. And we'll throw in one more for good measure. The villain, I wouldn't even call him a villain if you've seen the film, Project 2501, the puppet master, is played by Tom Weiner with the pseudonym Abe Lasser, if I pronounce that one right. Now, I'll be listing off other credits as I get to their scenes, but let's go ahead and get into this. The first scene in the film is this gorgeous shot with, it's the assassination shot. I'll leave it at that so I don't spoil too much. Actually, you know what? Spoilers. If you pause now, go watch Ghost in the Shell, come back so you do not get spoiled on some plot points or some cool scenes. You good? Great. So, opening scene is essentially, it starts out with telecommunications over the city, and you just hear all these different voices. The mix is phenomenal at that opening scene. Now, I know from what my research shows me, there's 2 voices, possibly 3 that I could discern. The main ones, Kirk Thornton, he was uncredited, but that was a pretty good, that it sounds like him. And from what my research tells me it was him. And then also in there, there's a Japanese-speaking helicopter pilot, has a credit for Gloria Gines under the pseudonym Gloria Oldman. Now, there are other voices in there, and I could speculate, maybe Leah Sargent's in there, but there's dozens of different languages that you can hear. But the mix is phenomenal. It really just gives off that 100 voices in my head, and it kind of tees you up for what's to come, and that just kind of leads into the situation where they then isolate into the major scene with the gavel diplomat. Okay, so this whole scene, it goes in, shows Major Kusanagi, shows her trying to isolate that. It plays static, it plays reverb. It shows you that rather than that green scene that we saw prior, it's actually, they changed it. They changed how it was mixed in her head, which I actually really appreciate from an audio perspective, because we see this a few different times in the movie when she's jacking in and looking for, people, looking for places, all that stuff. So she isolates into the actual conversation itself, into the first scene with the gavel diplomat, which was played by Hank Crowell Jr., credited as Steve Davis. Now, side note, apparently the pseudonym Steve Davis was used by Richard Consino. I'm still, a lot of names, a lot of things to remember. Apparently, he used that pseudonym for one of the Street Fighter animes. So, there's a few like that. There's actually 3, and I'll just get them out of the way now. We have Richard Consino had used the pseudonym Steve Davis. Skip Skelreck had used the pseudonym Hank Smith. Michael Forrest had used the pseudonym George Selick. And Bryan Cranston had used the pseudonym Phil Williams. So when I mention those pseudonyms under the other actors, just know that they use the same pseudonyms for 2 completely different films. Okay, with that being said, we go into this first scene, and just the back and forth between the diplomat, who is played by Hank Crowell Jr., and Mizuho Daita, played by Paul Stephen. Now, he was uncredited for that role, from what I can tell, but that is who I found played that role. Now, the conversation there, comparing it to the the English subtitles for the Japanese, it feels a lot more natural. Honestly, Paul Steven was a really good choice for being a programmer. As somebody who is a programmer, just the way that they portray him, honestly, I think it was a really good casting choice. We go into this, they're going back and forth, talking about everything, all that fun stuff. So, I have this scene, opens up, all that stuff. They're talking. It cuts to Bato, played by Richard Epcar, and then Togusa, and they're just talking. Honestly, with this first scene with Bato, some of the dialogue felt like it could have used a once over, in my opinion, just with delivery. But honestly, rewatching it a few different times, I think it comes off really well. I think the mix. Yeah, there it was. I was looking for the specific line. We're the ones who get our hands dirty. It's right near the end of that scene. And overall, for me, I feel like it could have used a once over. But I like the chemistry whenever Bato and Christopher Joyce and Richard Epcar are interacting with each other. I really like that chemistry. I like their banter. I think it works really well. I've listened to the Japanese one version as well, and I think the English version just has its own charm. And it'll be more apparent as I move forward into the scenes, but I think I've spent long enough on this one. So we're here, police are coming, and Kusanagi, Mimi, is about to, jump and intercept Section 6, because Section 6 is going after the same guy, the same target. So, with that being said, we go in there. SWAT teams break in. There's some shooting, all that fun stuff. And just as a few more casting things, 2 of the Section 6 officers are played by Joe Romersa, and let me find the other one real quick. Okay, here it is. So, I found it. So yeah, 2 of the officers that came in that we heard whenever they banged through was Joe Romersa, actually credited as Joe Michaels, which I find interesting because, Joe Romersa was already credited as himself at the top. So having no pseudonym there and a pseudonym here, I find very fascinating. And it's definitely one of the questions that I would like to ask down the line once I'm able to interview Joe more in depth, especially with some of the shows that he also directed. And then the female section officer was played by I think it's Joan Carroll or Joanne Carroll. I want to say it's Joan Carroll O'Connell as Joan Mason. So more pseudonyms. And they break in. They do a good job. I think the mix there is really good. And then comes one of the first actual really deep, just really back and forth between the gavel diplomat, and the Section 6 chief, played by Simon Prescott, under the pseudonym Ben Isaacson. And we're going to be seeing tons of the Section 6 chief. They're going back and forth. Honestly, some of the lines there... Okay, yeah. So, I was re-looking at the script for the English scene versus the Japanese scene. They definitely do a really good job, and this goes up to the script writers, to making it, rather than newer dubs sounding maybe a little bit more clunky or wanting to be more true to form. These scripts, it feels like they're allowed to take a bit more liberty and, go back and forth, use, more English sentence structure, all that fun stuff. So, I will say, though, I think one of the funniest things, though, is the not possible. I think, as I said, a lot of these older dubs, there are just a few little things where I'm just I could speculate, and as I said, I want to redo this one at some point just so I have more context for the recording process. I know this one, whenever I was talking to Joe a few weeks ago, he mentioned some of these older dubs didn't have the beep, which is the beep, 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 and then an imaginary fourth beep, and that's when you go. I am curious to know whether or not this had that or not. So whenever they were having to, hit their mark, these are questions for later. So they go back and forth. Yeah. So I won't stay too much longer on this scene, but essentially interaction goes, interaction between them, the dialogue, it's very political. So just some of the delivery from the gavel diplomat. I enjoy it. It's just I think I kind of wish I could have seen him more in the film, but as I said, spoilers. He is not long for this world as the Major ends up swooping in, shooting him, and then continuously falling, and then of course the Section 6 chief makes a note of that, and we move on. So, get shot, all that fun stuff, and then it goes straight into the title screen, some credits, sweeping shots, all that fun stuff. It looks like, if I recall, the Major getting rebuilt or maintenance. So, I'm actually going to jump to the next scene, or to the next part, which is going to lead us into... So, I want to talk about the next scene. It's between William Frederick Knight's character and then the Gavel Foreign Affairs Minister, played by Mike Reynolds, who was given the credit of Hank Smith. I mentioned this earlier with some of the duplicate pseudonyms that I ran into. Honestly, I think Mike Reynolds was a really good choice. I think he really got into character with he sounds like a foreign minister. Now, mind you, it's funny listening to dubs or even in Japanese sometimes when they talk about foreign ministers, but everyone's speaking the same language. There's very few animes that I remember off the top of my head. I can think of like Ranma 1/2 with, what's her name? She's the one that turns into a cat. But she'll speak Chinese and her Japanese is a little bit broken. And then there are, Evangelion with Asuka, who speaks German and Japanese. So I do find it interesting with some of these dubs where, they'll be a foreign minister, but they'll all just speak the same language. Now, we can chalk this up to the future, but I find that very interesting. Okay, actually, no, I forgot to mention this. Some of these shots are interesting, and this is just an animation thing, but I think the best acting comes from when the characters are turned around or their lips are off screen, so they don't have to actually sync to anything. They can just, I feel like it gives them more freedom. So they're talking on the elevator. They're talking about a scene that's coming up later. So there isn't too much here I want to talk about. It's just talking about the scene that I was mentioning earlier with the political asylum, all that fun stuff. They're going back and forth. So it's not a long scene, and to be honest, it does set up some stuff for later. It's a good setup scene, and I think William and Mike do a really good job of delivery. I think the editing is really well done. As I said, I think they definitely took advantage of the fact that the lips were turned around. So from a script writing perspective and from just an overall delivery, it gave them a lot more freedom. That then rolls into the next scene, which is when we see the foreign minister's, I want to say it's the aide or secretary, her brain gets hacked. Now, I do want to make note here because I think this is the only time I can mention this, but there is a credit for somebody. It's called Megatech Blonde. Yeah, Megatech Blonde. I found it in some of the credit reports. I know there's a credit on there for Amy Wong. Now that one is something I want to dig up. I don't think it's her because this actress never talks, but she's one of the only blondes in the anime. So I just wanted to bring that up. Other credits, they're the EGG cybernetists, so EGG being the brain scientists. Now, the two that we hear near the beginning of the scene, bringing the Major and everyone up to speed, are played by Darren Norris under the pseudonym Scott Prenser, and then Stephen Apostolina under the pseudonym Stephen Platt. So with that being said, I think, and this is just, I love this. I'm sorry. Whenever I hear really, because this, it's a dub, so you have to get the audio in there. When the mix is done so well, where if they're doing a wide shot, and it sounds like they're far away from where the camera is, and then they have the machinery, so whatever machinery it is, I really appreciate that. Like, sound, whenever you have a good mix, it's everything. And so, for me, for this, it took me forever to get the perfect mix that I liked. And then, of course, working out a few bugs. But we go into the analysis with them. All right. So, yeah, nothing too much there. As I said, it's a small scene, but it does introduce two more actors. It introduces a plot line that we're going to see later. Of course, well delivered. The mix is really well good. Sets the stage. All that stuff. And then they mention the puppet master. So, all right. So we go into the next part, which is the major filling in Togusa. This does a really good job of Mimi just introducing just whatever information the film has on the puppet master, interaction between Mimi's character and Christopher Joyce's character. I think, and this is like the first time I really get to like analyze Mimi as the major. There's a few bits and pieces, but to be honest, I haven't listened to the other majors because Mimi isn't the only one who's played Major Kusanagi, but I like her scenes here because with how the major is mostly cybernetic and very cold and calculating, I like how Mimi delivers for her. And she, except for a few scenes that I'll talk about later, I think she does a really good job of delivering the major, delivering the type of character that she is. And overall, like, maybe some of the lines may come off a little bit clunky or a little bit just calculated, but I think they really fit. And then, of course, the banter there. Now, I would be curious to know if, most dubs, they'll bring in one actor, they'll do their lines, but, sometimes they'll bring in for a group read. I would be curious to know if they did any group reads or any group recordings. If they didn't, then honestly, props to the crew for actually, the direction, the overall, just like, a lot of the lines sound so natural going back and forth and back and forth. Now, one thing I will note in one of the lines, a whisper, I feel it in my ghost. That kind of pattern is kept up with the script. They're very consistent with that, but if you look at the Japanese script, for some of them, they don't use the term ghost. But I like how the dub is consistent with that. I like how the script keeps consistent with that because it pays off, especially near the end of the film. And then I will say one last thing on this scene where it's Togusa and the major in the car. I do like the delivery that Christopher gives for talking about his mateba, his revolver, and how I don't know what it is. I like it a lot. So. Matever, that's what it was. But yeah, moving on, let me see what the next scene is here. Just overall, scene is really well done, dialogue, as I said, I do wonder if some of these actors got to record together just because of how natural some of the dialogue between the actors are and the characters are. So, moving on. My favorite part of the movie. Next up is probably one of my favorite parts of the movie. So they're going after a garbage truck drivers. They don't know they're going after. They're just going after the person who's hacking the Megatech, the blonde woman. And just to introduce a few more cast of characters, we have the garbage collectors. The one with the backwards hat, I'll just call him Garbage Collector A. That is voiced by Kevin Seymour. But a different pseudonym. I believe he actually has 3 pseudonyms in this whole film, too, so we're going to have fun with that. But he was for the character, it was Tom Carlton. And then the other garbage collector is Doug Stone. So the one who's actually talking about his wife, his kid, the one who got hacked. So with that being said, they're going back and forth, and Kevin, from what I understand with some interviews that I've done already, he, a director you can cast yourself. I think he did a good job casting himself as just the disgruntled garbage truck collector. I know in one of the I think it was in the Blu-ray, they used the term rubbish for the Japanese, which I find very interesting. But they're going back and forth. I actually really think that the chemistry there is really well done. I think for the very few lines that Kevin does have, I think he does them really well. Just because you're a director doesn't mean you can't act. Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, I'm going to point to her because she is both a phenomenal director and a phenomenal actor. And from what I hear, that's because of the experience that she got with Animaze, and I'll be discussing more about her with other projects, especially the ones that she directed. So, with that being said, I think Doug Stone in these scenes does a really good job of selling the fact his character's been mind-jacked. I think one of the coolest things that I learned from talking with Joe Romersa is a lot of these, the best way to act is to become your character, get into character, believe in your character, make it your reality while you're acting, which I agree with. I think doing that certainly helps. So with that being said, this is the next like major key piece. So I'm going to introduce some of the players right now. This is, as I said, one of my favorite scenes. So we have the garbage collectors, we have Togusa and Bateau and the Major all going after them. We have Swan Gang Fang, from what they say his name differently in the subtitles, but he is credited to John Schneider. It was actually uncredited, but that's the data that I found. Now, one thing I want to note in the credits, there is a credit for a quote-unquote bad guy. This is the only guy that I can think of that would fit that description. It's weird, because the bad guy was credited to David Conrad. Now, my speculation is that the bad guy, like David Conrad, is a John Schneider alias. But at the same time, I've seen stuff where it's for Peter Spellos. But then there's also another Peter Spellos, which is Gilbert Navarro. So I'm going to get into that as we get there, but I just want to make note of that here. And then the last one, there is the old man who's trying to dump his garbage, who I find a riot. I think the voice that Dan Lorge did for him, who was credited as George Selick, I think he did a really good job of delivering that. So with that being said, we go into that. The garbage collector, Doug Stone's garbage collector, just does a really good job. We go through the scene. They're going back and forth, talking about the family. You have Kevin's character, kind of spouting back, being like, I don't want to be your accomplice. I don't want anything to do with you. I'm just here to do my job. My last partner was better. Overall, probably one of my favorite scenes. Some of the inflictions, too. Honestly, out of all the characters, I think the character arc that Doug Stone's character had to go through, I think Doug does a really good job. I think the direction on that was really well done. And to be honest, I wish that we had more of them. And I will say, Kevin's comments, or Kevin's delivery with, you think you own the damn road. I always find that a riot. With some of the other stuff I hear later with some of Kevin, because Kevin's got one more role in here with another pseudonym. I think for the little dialogue that he did, I think he did a really good job. I think that some of the liberty that the script had with adding in more like English-based, dialogue. So that kind of delivery is something that you would hear from somebody who speaks English. And I do like Doug Stone's more calm demeanor. I like their chemistry. And as I said, I wish we would have had more of them I wish I could have more scenes with them just to see what other, delivery they could have. So, and one more actor I forgot to introduce, which he's not in the movie that much, but we have the character, let me find this real quick, because he's not in the movie that much. He is Ishikawa, played by Michael Sorek. He's in the passenger seat with Bateau, and he's credited as Mike Sorek. Still, I wouldn't count it as a pseudonym. I would just count it as a shortening of the name, but he does go by something that is different than what his full name is, so I made note of it. So, I will just make a few more notes here before I move on to whenever it flips over to Swan Gang Fang. They're oh, wait, actually, I don't have to, because there is a little bit more. I will note here that a lot of communication is done through wireless means. If you've ever seen like Cyberpunk 2077 or any futuristic movie, you tend to see a lot of dialogue that is done through some form of, it's not telepathy, but it's non-verbal. Like there's no mouth movement. As I mentioned, there's some really good dialogue when they don't have to worry about syncing up to mouth flaps. More performance from William Frederick Knight. I think the casting for Aramaki was really well done. I think that his character, especially with what the character is supposed to be, I think William did a good job with it. And I do like, and this isn't for the dub in particular, but I do like how they use Aramaki in the story. So with that said, I'm gonna move on to just a quick little thing. Kusanagi jacks into the police route, and this one, there's a few instances of this, so I'm just going to talk about it now, but there's a credit for Leah Sargent as the security voice now. Which security voice? There's a dozen of them, and to be honest, I think there's other operators that we see from Section 9, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but just note that there are at least 6 different actresses that in my opinion, I think we hear their dialogue being used or them acting. Like if Kusanagi or any of the other Section 9 people are looking into stuff, I do believe that their voices are used. I even speculate that some of them were used at the beginning with the teleoperators for the female voices. Moving on though, I already mentioned the old guy. I really like Dan Lorge's performance. Now, there is a drive-by pedestrian. Now, there is a pedestrian credit. I'm going to mention them now, but I think there are other pedestrians that we see. There is a credit for a pedestrian by Skip Stelrecht. I'm gonna butcher his name. I'm about to see him too in like a week or two, so I feel bad. I'll have to ask him, but I think it's Skip Stelrecht. His pseudonym was Leo Gray. And then Neighborhood Man, Michael Sorek. This one was uncredited, but I'm going to take the word on it. I can always get correction. I'm about to see him at another show that I'm doing. So, and then lastly, Milton James, pseudonym Murray Williams, as a market goer. Now I'm going to get into the market in a minute because that is another scene very similar to the telecommunications scene at the beginning of the movie, where it's just a lot of mixed audio. So, and then one last thing. Because I want to keep going. I'm taking so much time on these beginning scenes, but that's how it is. I do like how the audio is mixed, whenever it's non-verbal, so how they mix Mimi's audio. Whenever she's taking over the wheel, it's non-verbal, it's through a mental gate or through a mental uplink. There it is. I like that mix, so we move on. We go into the chase scene where they've been made. They panic. Doug Stone's character panics. Kevin Seymour's character just kind of is like, what the crap. So, more good performances from Mimi and Richard. As I said, I've said that, and I keep repeating myself, but just overall, the delivery, all that stuff. But there isn't really too much. I want to get into the market because that part is just really fun. It goes into Swan Gang Fang. Oh. Before I go into there, one other thing, I just remember this from a story from when I was talking to Joe Romersa, is whenever delivery required, like, hey, this character is at a long distance, the direction from what I was told was act like you're from a long distance, like yell. And from the times that we see it in this movie, I think that is done really well. So let me keep going here. So yeah, we go into the market. There's a few little scenes here and there, but I really want to get to the market. So we're going to get to the market. So there's a ton of I could nitpick little sound bites from the market. I don't know, they probably just got a lot of the different actors to just say lines. I can hear a few that I recognize. They just do a really good job at that. There it is. I found it. Our final credit for Kevin Seymour is it's near the end of the market scene. It's for the ferryman. And this one is Kevin Seymour as Michael Porter. And it's literally just Kevin's character being pushed into water and him just falling. So I wanted to make note of that. I'm going to get to the next major scene. There's a lot of fighting, all that stuff. And it's Fang versus the Major. And one thing that I really appreciate is the seriousness of Fang until he loses, And then Kusanagi, the major, just drops that just cold line of, "You can't help me." Yeah, like you don't even know your own name. Like, and then asks, name. Yeah, she just, "You can't help me. You don't know your own name." Said, I think Mimi just, delivery for that was good. Bato, same thing for Richard. I'm actually gonna skip a bit ahead on this. And I've mentioned this a few different times, it feels like there was a lot of liberty in the script to make the lines more favorable for English, maybe add some curse words, or use, if they did use curse words in the Japanese, make them more English-friendly ones. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so now we get to the scene that was foreshadowed earlier in the movie with the meeting with the guy that wanted to be, the foreign minister wanted to be deported. It's more radio chatter from between Bato and Aramaki. As I said, I think the best delivery in this movie is during those chatters. I think just because, if they were given more time for takes or whatnot, I don't know. One last thing on the garbage guys. I think going from the Doug Stone's garbage collector at the beginning, and then during the interrogation when he is just broken, I think Doug does a really good job of that. He's being disillusioned, but at the same time he can't comprehend it, and I think Doug does a really good job. And honestly, what I'm looking forward to is doing more of these analyses and reviews on these episodes, so I can hear more of their performances. Because some of these actors I've heard plenty, but others I haven't as much. So I think Doug, just kind of the last scene with the character, I think Doug did a really good job. One sad thing, though, is, and this is just from a story perspective, the photo that he was showing Kevin's character earlier in the movie was just a picture of him next to a dog, and we see this dog later in the movie. So I don't know. It's fascinating. Just very, very broken man, but at the same time, like, how do you direct somebody to say, "Oh, by the way, your character is hacked"? Like, do you withhold that and just tell them who their character is? Like, how do you get into that character, that delivery? I would love to see the script notes for this, if I'm being honest. But yeah, and then it's Christopher Joyce's character and Richard Epcar's character. This is another good scene transition where it has beautiful music, beautiful animation, and it goes into the boat scene, which is very fascinating because it's probably one of those scenes that I do have my one major delivery gripe. A few little notes here for this scene. I think with the timing that they had to get some of Richard's deliveries, I would analyze that he couldn't have as many pauses. I think he had to go back to back just for timing, which aren't you afraid the floaters could go out? I didn't think you were into this kind of thing. I think the fact that he had to go through this quickly, I could always it's something to keep note of, I guess. So there's a scene in the evening section where, here it is. So this is actually the line this is the scene that I want to spend just a minute or two on, just because it's something that, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this one first. I wanted to use it as an analysis because it's a great dub, but at the same time it is fascinating to kind of go back and retroactively analyze. She's like, "I feel fear, cold, alone." That delivery right there. Now, you could, looking at it from it just the delivery, I feel like could have been maybe a few more takes. Maybe that unnaturalness was what they were going for. I guess for me, I think I would have had a bit more of a pause personally, but I think it's interesting. It's one of those few deliveries for Mimi that I'm like, it's I actually don't know the word for it, but it's interesting, and she continues to go. She keeps going with her speech, and then the whole monologue there is just, it's one of those that I would love to actually I still would love to interview Mimi about this, and I think she's in a few other things. I know she's in the video game for the PS1, and I know there's a few other Animaze projects she's in, but for her role as the Major, I would love to ask her more questions about, recording for this, experiences, stories, if you will. And one of the coolest things, I'm not going to go over too much how they're talking about their cybernetic bodies. I will note, though, that Richard's delivery of just bouncing off of Mimi is just really well done. I'm glad that Richard is stuck on as Bato for I think he's Bato for all of them or most of them. So I'm still doing research into Ghost in the Shell, so I know he's stuck around for a while. So Mimi kind of goes back into the same cadence that I've noticed that the Major carries, but there's a great delivery, and it's done by Mimi after after one of her speeches. So you listen, you hear, she's talking, and then in their heads they hear another voice. It's Mimi's voice, but it's the character, the puppet master, speaking in her voice, which I always love it when it's done one of two ways. Either the actor speaks, like, pretending to be, like the puppet master is speaking using another person's voice, so that other person will actually act as though, they'll act. Or you'll have instances where an actor will impersonate. I think a good example is the Japanese cast for quintessential quintuplets. Maybe even the English. I'd have to ask the director, but I know that for the Japanese, they actually can impersonate each other, and they did so they didn't have to bring in the other actress to play her. I think both are interesting. In this case, the puppet master is using the Major's voice, and I like how the inflection is different, so you can tell something's off. And this comes back around at the end of the movie when you can tell that the Major has changed significantly after the events of the finale. So we move on. Next. We're at one of the other big scenes. It's the part where, I don't want to say it's a canal. It's a canal. Yeah, it's a canal. And it's gorgeous. And I don't know what it is. Animaze got so lucky. I wouldn't even say lucky, but a lot of the stuff they got to work on, that Kevin got to work on, has gorgeous animation, amazing, Japanese directors, animators, amazing stories. You have Akira, Perfect Blue, Cowboy Bebop, Trigun, Code Geass, which is one of my personal favorites, and just a whole bunch more. All the titles that they did work on can be found on the archive on the website, but it baffles me thinking about how many of these just have gorgeous animation and phenomenal music. So we get past that, just a few side notes. We see, the dog from the photo. We see the Major. We see a lot of cool stuff. Next, I'm going to introduce a few more characters. So I had mentioned the EGG scientist, cybernetist earlier, played by Darren Norris. There is another scientist that actually looks similar. Different guy, but it's the Section 9 staff cybernetist / the coroner. Says red coat. I've seen a few different things. They have that voiced by Steve Boulin. So what just happened right now, moving on, is the puppet master got into a body, all this stuff. Said the mix, as I said, for this scene right here is phenomenal. Anytime there's radios, anytime there's nonverbal communication through wireless means, just the way that they mix and distort the audio. Who did the mixing? I'm just going to go with, we have, Joe, Les Claypool, and then, of course, you have some of the mixers here with, like, Paul, Kurt, and Armin. Phenomenal work across the board there. And honestly, stuff like that needs more credit because that stuff's hard. I am trying to learn how to do that stuff myself, and it's not even sound being a difficult thing. It's the equipment to mold sound into what you want. And so I find it so fascinating. And it's why I got into sound into the first place, direction, all the stuff that they do. I'm teaching myself, or I'm learning by asking questions. And honestly, it makes me so happy that I've been able to learn so much in so little time. So, with that being said, we have more from our leads. Same thing. Overall, our core cast of characters, going back and forth about the unknown. We know it's the puppet master, but they don't know at this point in the movie. So we move on. So, not to get too bogged down, there was one other line that I really liked in the script with Richard Epcar's character essentially asking William Knight's character, what are your thoughts on the scientists that monkey around in your head? And just the delivery, very just to the point. I appreciate dialogue like that. I really do. So with that being said, we continue onward. This is when the Section 6 chief and Dr. Willis show up looking for the puppet master. We're still continuing onward. We kind of have two different concurrent scenes going on, or two concurrent. We have the part with the Section 6 and 9 chiefs, and Dr. Willis, and then trying to get the puppet master and all that stuff. And then after that, we have Togusa's, Christopher Joyce's character going, and investigating, why are there two cars, this, that, the other thing. So, same thing, delivery across the board. I'm not going to go talk too much more about the leads until I get to parts that I just feel like really need to be discussed. And I think at the very end of the movie is where I'm going to talk more about the major, and I'm going to talk more about Bato and a few of the dialogue there. But a lot of it is just, it's the same. They are their characters. I think they do a really good job of embodying embodying their characters. And what's interesting is I've met Richard once at a prior show, and I've gotten to talk to him about some of his other characters that he's played. But just I find it interesting how Bato is just, it's not as deep. Richard Epcar's voice can go deep. So the fact that, somebody like Bato, this goes back, 30 years ago, it's fascinating how it's deep, but it's not as deep as a lot of people know Richard's voice now. It has, a lot of range there. And then, Mimi said, I'm looking forward to watching more of Mimi's performances. It would have been interesting to see her portray the major in other projects, but from my research, apparently she had moved away from LA, from what I could tell, and retired from voice acting. So it is interesting looking at her, one of the big project that she's in. But I'm trying to find I'm just going to eyeball this one. My notes don't have this, but I remember the scene. So I'm going to bring this up now, just so I don't have to bring it up later. I had mentioned earlier that besides Leah Sargent, labeled as the security voice, there are 5 other people that are part of Section 9, and I have them labeled as Section 9 operators A through E. You can hear all 5 of them performing later on in the movie, but I do want to bring them up now, just because I feel like it's relevant, especially with a lot of the female operators we're hearing. So we'll start in order. If you're looking on the archive, I'm going to go in order from A through E. We have Deborah Jean Rogers, credited as S.J. Charvin, Charvin. We have Operator B. This one's interesting. We have it as Mona Marshall, who I didn't realize she did a lot of anime voice work prior to I think her most known role is, I want to say South Park, as a lot of the female characters, but I just find it interesting. I love it. I love hearing her performances. She's credited as Gina Connell. We have Dorothy Fawn, credited as Dorothy Gabriel. We have Wanda Nowicki, as Tom Burke. And then I have somebody named Meg Hamilton. Now, Meg Hamilton, I could assume is a pseudonym, but I'm not 100% sure. With that being said, I will throw a few more credits in here because we're about to get to another big chase scene with a bunch of bad guys. So I mentioned earlier that there was a credit for a bad guy. It was under David Conrad. Now, if we assume that David Conrad was Swan Gang Fang, then David Conrad should be attributed to John Snyder. However, I had a Peter Spellos have both David Conrad and Gilbert Navarro as pseudonyms. So this is definitely something I'm going to look into more and have like an addendum to this episode with a lot of these questions answered. But just for sanity's sake, I have him kind of listed as bad guy and at the same time Kidnapper A, which I feel like Kidnapper A is right. I said I want to look into David Conrad more. I think John Snyder used that one personally, but I don't know until I have an answer. And then Kidnapper B, which only had like a grunt, but it was credited to Steve Bloom under the alias Roger Confield. So, and we're through most of the cast. Like, there might be a few people that I missed, might be some miscellaneous voices that I hear but can't place, which, it happens, but we move on. And we keep thinking. I will note for additional voices, I do have one more. Christopher Carroll as Ben Parks. So I'm assuming he's peppered around here for some of the male voices. I will say though that some of the highlights for this for delivery has been the voices that are just like there, the disembodied voices. You have Leah, you have all those people that I just mentioned earlier with the Section 9 operators. And then there's a few more. There's some drivers that I'll mention later. But overall, same level of performances. I think I'm going to touch on Togusa, Christopher Joyce, just the way he handled, the way the delivery is for just, I don't know. I just enjoy his performance as Togusa. I really do. There's a few of these actors that I wish they would have continued on doing the role, but, everyone makes their, life happens, things happen. So I don't know for sure on some of this stuff. It's why I'm doing this podcast. It's the stories of Kevin Seymour, the stories of Animaze, and so these questions they're burning up inside me, Oh, yeah. Using the counting system was very interesting. 1001, 1002, 1003. I think that's very interesting because that is very, how I would count in English. So I'm going to jump because, there's going to be some back and forth between Section 6 and Section 9's chiefs. But the highlight for this scene is the Puppet Master. First time we've heard him speak in his actual voice, not in the voice of Kusanagi. And little fun fact, for the English, or not even for the English, for the first recording of this in Japanese, the Puppet Master has a male voice, but they went back and redubbed it, like redubbed the whole movie, and they called it, I think, Ghost in the Shell 2.0. And apparently they swapped it for a female voice, which I find interesting. But I think the male AI, the male artificial ghost, paired with the Kusanagi's, the mirror image, I think it just works better. I think Tom and Mimi do like a really good job of being a dichotomy of one another. I think Joe said it perfectly. Kevin liked to cast like it was an orchestra. You had you had the higher end of the spectrum with like Leah Sargent. You had the lower end of the spectrum like Richard Epcar. And I think with the casting of this, mind you, back then, you didn't have a full roster of people, but just I think it's the balance between the ranges is phenomenal. And before we get to near the end of the movie, I just wanted to touch on that because between that, the scenes where there is really good mixing, like all the voices, the loud scenes, like the market and the beginning of the movie, I think those are really well done. So, we go into the speech for the Puppet Master, and just it is, Tom just has this phenomenal voice. It comes off as something that is not human, but at the same time is human. Very, very machine-like. And I will note with the Puppet Master being mostly, I keep on want to say that use the word non-verbal, because that's not the right word. But essentially the way that the character is used in the movie is he's speaking into your head. So with that being said, honestly, it gives Tom probably the most freedom in the whole movie. Just being able to, deliver his lines. And on top of that, the script writers did a really good job of giving, whenever they were doing, rewrites, just the articulation, the delivery from Tom really just brought the character to life. I think if they had gone a different direction, I think it wouldn't have been as potent as Tom's delivery. And honestly, I'm kind of, out of all the versions, the Japanese 2.0, and English, I think Tom's is the most calculative, so to speak. It kind of gives me a little bit of Matrix vibes. Not Fishburne. Like, it gives me a little bit of Lawrence Fishburne vibes, but at the same time, it's distinct enough. But like whenever the Morpheus character is discussing, the real world, that's kind of the vibe that I get from the Puppet Master performance. Yeah. And then you have, goes in after the whole monologue. There's the break-in with the two kidnappers I mentioned. They pull the Puppet Master and escape. And so I'm going to move on to, yes, the only voice role of Joe Romersa in this whole film. Oh, no, there's a few. Is there a few? No, there was a few. I lied. I remember talking about Joe earlier at the beginning of the movie as Joe Michaels. But there is another Joe Michael, Joe Romersa as Joe Michaels. So whenever the kidnappers are escaping, there's this truck. And I remember looking over this scene in English and Japanese, and it was interesting because at the very end, whenever I think it's labeled crash truck driver, which I just think that's kind of funny. They add, just kind of similar to with the garbage collectors, it feels like they added more lines. Oh yeah, there's the line. You can blow that horn out your ass. Quoting a line there. But I think in the Japanese he just says like baka, he says idiot, but I think he swears him off. I can't say the word just because I'm trying to keep this non-explicit, but I think he said like F off or something like that. So it's those little things right there. I like how, I think one thing that I would have changed though is it's raining. I think is it raining out in there? Let me double check the scene. No, it's not raining. It's just the footage that I'm looking at. I've reviewed I think all three. I've looked at the 4K version, the Blu-ray version, and now I'm looking at the VHS version just for reference for some of these scenes, just so that means I don't misremember something. And I feel like with a truck, I would have honestly raised the truck engine's noise a little bit, or at least because of how far the shot was, I think just lowering how audible Joe was. Like, I could clearly hear the FU. I think making it less, like, make it more, I don't want to say potent, but, using, how Kevin directed, if you're far away, you kind of have to yell. Mind you can take that same thing and say that the crash truck driver was pissed and yelled, but, and then the other thing, same consistency with the mixing for the mind link speak. I find that very interesting, and as I said, I like how that's mixed. I like the how you can tell the difference. Yeah. All right. So we had the chase scene out. We're about to get to the part where Steve Bloom and Peter Spellos' characters get killed, but we're actually starting to get near the end of the movie. So now, we're going to be wrapping up kind of on the stuff with Bato and Like, Bato is kind of not going to come back until the end of the movie. A lot of the other characters, I think we get one scene. I'll talk about it right now, but there's a scene where Section 9 Chief, or no, yeah, the Section 9 Chief, so William's character, and then Ishikawa, which is played by Michael Sorek. Sorek actually gets some longer dialogue than what was happened earlier with him and Richard Epcar in the car scene earlier in the movie. Well performed. Like, a lot of these performances, you think about this as 30 years ago, and it's still impressive. You know, a lot of these actors are still acting to this day. You know, especially, you know, Steve Bloom and let me see if there's, and Kirk Thornton, just to name two. And I think also Mona Marshall. So it's fascinating hearing them, you know, 20, 30 years ago in this footage, and, you know, some of them, like Steve, only has a death sound. But then you have somebody like Kirk who's playing all these uncredited roles, like the telecommunication noises we hear at the beginning. The scene we're about to go into in the film, the section of the movie is Kirk is now playing the Section 9 helicopter pilot, the one that takes Mimi's character to kind of the end, I'll call it the end game spot, where the movie wraps up. I will point out a few more scenes just to get them out of the way, shotgun style, because they're short, they're sweet, because I want to really discuss the end of the movie. So we have, you know, some dialogue between the pilot and Kusanagi as they're flying out. There's a conversation in a car where it's between Dr. Willis and the Section 6 chief. So that would be Marvin Brickett and Simon Prescott. Kind of wrapping up some of our cast members before we get to the end game of the cast members. The Section 6 driver who talks to them during the scene is played by Donald Salin. Small role, but I think the performance is solid right there. There's two more that I found. I don't know where to place them, so I'm going to bring them up right now. There's a few, actually. So I got, for a Section 6 escort, which I still have yet to find, but I found a credit for it for Skip as Leo Gray, and then a Section 6 technician, which I want to say the technician is near the end of the film. If I had a script, I would know this stuff, but I don't. But that is played by Stephen Apostolina, Stephen Platt, and then apparently there's some Section 9 snipers that I might have missed, played by Michael Sorek and Stephen Apostolina. Like, there's some credits I'm still trying to figure out with this, just from my sources. There's still one last batch of credits I'll bring up near the end of the movie, just because I want to save them for the end of the film. But there's the driver's scene, there's the helicopter scene. So near the end of this, they're just trying to wrap up a bunch of loose ends. To be honest, I think the film could have been, you know, another like 20 minutes just to make some of these scenes go a bit longer. But I said I'm not the producer, the director of the movie, so those are just my own 2 cents. With that being said, we have, you know, it rolls into the scene where they end up capturing the truck, the decoy car, because they put the puppet master in a separate vehicle. Kusanagi went for one, Bato went for the other, and we just hear death noises from Steve Bloom and Peter Spellos, and as I said, they were the decoy. So, just one last note on the Ishikawa stuff. As I said, I wish there was more Ishikawa. I love Michael Sorek's performance as Ishikawa. I think it's interesting. I think Ishikawa should have had more lines in the movie. I think he was just kind of used. Now, mind you, Ghost in the Shell is a franchise, so there is most likely more of each of them from what I can tell. But I would have loved to have heard more. As I said, if this movie was like another 15, 20 minutes longer, I think I would have gotten my wish. Let me keep going. Oh, yeah. So there's a scene near the end of the movie, right before we get into our end game. This is where I mentioned the 5 actresses, where they're all just... You have your 5 operators who are just all talking, it's whenever they're tracking the cars. So you got Mona, Deborah, Dorothy, Wanda, and Meg. And I'm assuming Leah is mixed in there too. And it's beautifully mixed. I think, the fact that, like I can tell, okay, it goes one after another with a little bit of overlay occasionally. I think that really sells it for me. I think noise, having more than one character speaking at the same time, really sell. Like, we don't have that a lot anymore. It's A, B, C. You don't have these A, B, B, C, A, C, B, A, B, C. Like, it is a bit of a jumble, but that can sell a scene. That can sell, because I could start talking and then Bill could start talking. It's not like I can control when he talks or doesn't talk, so it feels a lot more natural if we accidentally start talking at the same time. So let me get to the end game notes. I already talked about the death grunts. There it is. So we get to the building, and it's mostly an action scene. Now, mind you, there are sound effects that Mimi does. Delivery, especially when she's in combat, she is yelling, she is projecting. As I said, that is just well done on that. Now, I'm glad that the animators did have a lot of the detail with the gear, so her ears weren't blown out with all the gun. Let me keep looking real quick. Yeah, a lot of the end game stuff is combat between a tank and Kusanagi. So not a lot of dubbing stuff. I will note, since we are near the end of the movie, and this is the last combat section before we end up with just dialogue for the rest of the movie, I know that Les was credited for adding additional sound effects, so I always wonder where they added stuff. Like, I can assume, with mixing and all that, that's where you add the English, like if you have to modify the voice for radio or static-y soundness to it. But I am always curious, I would love to hear it from him. Where did he need to add things? So whenever I get the chance to interview him and talk with him, I know I won't be able to ask him about everything, but with stuff like that, I am curious where things were added, where additional sound effects were added versus the Japanese. Now, mind you, I could go in and have a side-by-side comparison, but that's, if I really, really wanted to, I could. And honestly, if it continues, if I keep on seeing this credit, I might start doing that. But I think it gives me a lot of questions to ask, and honestly, some nice stories to hear about how these Animaze dubs were produced. So, yep, we have the music, this, that, the other thing. Oh yeah, I will say Bato talking about about getting the gun. It reminds me of being a collector. It's like, oh yeah, and I had to go get it. Just very nonchalant. I said I feel that these characters, even though they're cybernetic, and this movie is talking a lot about what it means to be human. I think the performances are very human, even with the leads being mostly cybernetic, especially Kusanagi. And I will note just the moment that now we don't have to worry about animation. Mimi just knocks it out of the park for the next I want to say her and Tom's back and forth at the end of the movie lasts probably a good 5-10 minutes. Now, with that being said, I'm going to introduce the last of the cast that I have on my list. So if I miss anybody or whatnot, then, as I said, there's an addendum. So now we're at the point where we have, they've beaten the... I didn't really talk... I kind of skipped over it, but yeah, tank fight's done. There isn't really much to talk about there in regards to the dubbing process. I said unless there's additional stuff that was added. But now we have all the snipers. So, Section Snicks. Yes, Snicks. I would like Snicks, please. Section 6 Sniper Team. So, I have a bunch of different people that are either uncredited or credited. So, I'm just going to go through these. I'm going to say that the Section 6 technician might be in there, because there are technicians that I'm seeing. And I'm Steven Apostolina. That's where I think he fits in. I still need to find where that is. Then the Section 6 Sniper Team Leader has it, John Snyder is what I've seen it as, even though it's uncredited. And then Snipers A through E, because that's how I had them labeled. We have Kim Strauss under the pseudonym Sam Schaefer, Michael Sorick, uncredited, Richard Cancino, uncredited, Darren Norris as Scott, was it Prenzer? And then Skip Stelrek as Leo Gray. So, and then I want to say there's a few more voices. There is, like, inside the helicopter, there are technicians by the looks of it. They're not pure snipers. Hence why I say the Steven might be one of those voices. And there's probably a few more. I said whenever it comes to those crowds. So, we're going into the thing. I already mentioned the cast for the snipers. And then, of course, later on we're going to see, helicopter pilots. So I won't go too in depth, but I will note, because I am at like an hour and a half on this recording, and I want to leave some time for like a final review and just overall wrap up of the first episode. But the conversation between Mimi and Tom's characters, being Kusanagi and the puppet master, it is the dichotomy of them. You're talking, Tom's monologue. It wraps the movie, the premise and plot of the movie up so well, and Tom doesn't have a lot of dialogue in the movie, but what he does have, he nails. He nails spectacularly, and I look forward to seeing other stuff that he is in, because he is phenomenal as an actor. And I'm surprised I'm glad I started diving into this stuff. But moving on, we have all that. Bato is really trying, near the end of that. Snipers are about to kill both of them. Richard sells that his arm got shot off, and both of them are presumed dead or missing. And then, of course, you have more dialogue from the sniper team. And we move on to the secret finale, because I have one last cast member to introduce, or one last character. And it's actually one of the coolest things, and I wish they would have stuck with the bit. I need to compare it to the Japanese, but I love this English. I love it in English, and I wish that they would have continued it. So, they recover, Kusanagi's head, because it survives because of Bato, and he is able to put the head onto a new body that he was able to get off the black market of a little girl android body. Nothing high tech like her old one, but whenever she comes to in Bato's safe house, which let me pull up for reference. So yeah. Oh, I did want to honorable mention to Richard's Motoko. I will note delivery with his character is perfect. You could argue, it could be more serious, it could be more dire, but I think with just how the characters are and how they're hardened soldiers, I think it's just the perfect amount. So, and then of course her audio thing goes out, so they don't have to record anything of him saying anything. But I think one last thing I want to note before I continue on is right when her last line, she says, Bato, her tone changed. It actually changes. It's a small detail, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I noticed that whenever she says Bato, this is after the puppet master and her kind of fuse and become one entity, and that her tone matches what we see at the final scene, which I think she's credited as young Kusanagi. Yeah, young Motoko Kusanagi. And she wakes up, and it's played by Mona Marshall again. Which is awesome. Like, I love how Mona just has a much, higher, younger pitch than Mimi does. Of course, having a killer android girl, it's in style now, but back then, I'd be terrified if Mona Marshall's Kusanagi came, running at me. It'd be absolutely terrifying. It kind of gives me Wendy from South Park a little bit vibes. So that's the last of it. Just to kind of wrap up, while she's talking, it then shifts back. She changes her audio to match Mimi's voice, which, as I said, in my personal opinion, I think it would have been cooler for her to just keep that voice, because then it was a kind of a newborn voice, which is what the whole speech was about, making their own offspring from the two beings fusing together and then dispersing. But her delivery changes. Like, you can tell Mimi has a shift in how she delivers. It feels a lot more human, because now it's this separate new being that is both and neither Kusanagi and the Puppet Master. So with that being said, movie wraps up, credits roll, and I for research I ended up watching and rewatching the movie a few, like maybe 3-4 times, and I would catch new things every time I watched it. And to be honest, it's not my favorite Animaze project. I won't know what is until I've watched everything. But I'm glad that I started with Ghost in the Shell. I could have started with like Guyver or Orgus, one of the like older stuff that was originally LA Heroes, like Kevin's first works. But I'm glad I kind of started in the middle. Like, it's something that is, I think I said 96. So I think a lot of this was like 94, 95. But then you didn't have, some of the bigger stuff until 98, 99. Like, I want to say like Bebop. Was Bebop? Let me double check. This is why I have notes. This is why I built the archive, is so I could use it as kind of as a notepad. Yeah, so yeah, Bebop was 99. You had a few other, Battle Athletes, Bastard being a TV show. You had Armitage, some of the Armitage stuff. So Armitage, they were kind of doing this around this time, so it explains, Skip and all that stuff. A few little honorable notes real quick that I found while digging for stuff. As I mentioned earlier, you had the whole Street Fighter pseudonym stuff that I mentioned earlier. I also mentioned that, there was a video game of Ghost in the Shell on the PS1 that came out in the same year, 97, which I plan on doing a full playthrough of and uploading to YouTube and having an episode on that. Those video game ones will be, I'm still trying to find a style, but for the video game ones, I'm just going to go off of memory rather than having like images pulled up for myself as notes. Those are going to be more so reviews of the performances. They might be shorter. I'm hopefully going to get maybe a special guest to talk with me on those. But yeah, so that is one of the Ghost in the Shells done. I have, it looks like 6 more to go, because I have the Ghost in the Shell video games, for standalone and regular. I have standalone second gig, I have Solid State, and then I have Ghost in the Shell 2. So there will be a lot of Ghost in the Shell content. So I'm not done with this franchise yet. Overall, I am glad that I started doing this. I'm glad that, I'm able to learn and kind of talk about these shows, because without them, I really don't think the industry, especially with Animaze being behind a lot of these, I don't think the industry would be where it's at today without Animaze, without Kevin Seymour, without Utaka, without Les and Mary Claypool, without Joe Romersa. I think for Western cartoons, the best example would be the Flapjack domino effect, where the Misadventures of Flapjack, most of the animators that worked on that show, like assistants, ended up doing their own shows, like Chowder, Gumball, Adventure Time, Steven Universe. The list goes on. There's a chart somewhere, but I think the same thing applies to Animaze. I think that, and I'm going to talk more about this in other episodes, but I would just want to get it into my first, is I look at what they worked on. I look at who they've worked with, and I realize that some of the best directors and actors that, you go to these conventions or you see them all over the place, and you realize that they got their start because of Kevin Seymour, because of Animaze, And the thing I'm really trying to convey with these episodes, and I will be doing so moving forward as well, is, the performances are half the picture. I don't think the performances would nearly have been as good without the crew. And so I'm going to give one last shout out to the crew that worked on Ghost in the Shell. Excuse me, heartburn. Kevin, Mary, Les, Joe, Yutaka, and then, of course, some of the translators, Taro, Paul, and Nobuhiro. Yeah, and then honestly, looking at the talent, seeing what they end up doing in the future, over the next 25, 30 years, I am glad that I've gotten to meet who I've gotten to meet and talk to. And I'm looking forward. I think when this episode airs, which should be Friday, November the 14th, I'll be 1 week away from my next show in New Orleans. So if you're at New Orleans, you're listening, I will be at the NostalgiaCon New Orleans the next Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And I'll be able to meet up with and speak with Michael Sorek, Skip Skelrick, and a few others that weren't from this episode, like Sandy Fox and Lex Lang. I look forward to producing more of these episodes. So this one, a bit rough. I actually have to go figure out a few bugs in my software because some of these audio stuff I wasn't ready for. But that's what it is. So if you're still here at the end of this episode, I appreciate you sticking it out to the end. I really do. This has been something that I've been working on for over a year now, and it wasn't until I actually really got the push that I needed that I really, really put this serious. Like, God, what was that grammar? I really wanted to do this, and so I did. And so, yeah. Also, I'll give people a little sneak peek. The next episode will be airing in 2 weeks' time because I have a show next week. So the next episode will be coming out Friday, November the 28th. And as a little sneak peek, it will either be the movie Catnapped, or it will be the first Armitage movie, which I'm still looking to get a copy. But yeah, thank you so much for letting me just talk about something that I'm passionate about. And my hope for these reviews and these analyses is that with time and with interviews, I have more knowledge, I have more behind the scenes information, and I can deliver what my dream is for this, because I want this to live on, these stories. And so I really do thank each and every one of you who's stuck it out. And I look forward to releasing more episodes. So thank you so much. If you want to see more of the project, go ahead and check out Animazing, the stories of KevinSeymour.com. If you don't want to type all that out, just look up animazeinc.com. It's the reconstructed website of the owner, the original, I'll use the word owner of Animaze Inc., Kevin Seymour. I rebuilt it from scratch. I found old archives and I was able to reconstruct it. From there, you click the Animazing link. That will take you to my website, and then in turn, click the archive button, and there will be an under construction archive. So I look forward to next week for my show, and then I look forward to having the next episode out in 2 weeks' time. So stay tuned, and I'm going to let the Just play us out.